Okay, so we're going to ignore some of these special cases and these specific examples. I don't think that's important for this class. I also don't want to focus too much on elasticity here. There are like some problems and stuff in the chapter, but I don't think that's really necessary for our purposes. But I do want you to kind of understand the basics because it is important to understand the elasticity of substitution. So remember, we use elasticity to measure the responsiveness of changes. In this case, we can do it for changes in employment due to changes in wages. So this relates to how firms adjust their labor to capital ratio when the cost of one input changes compared to the cost of another. If the elasticity of substitution is high, firms can easily switch between labor and capital when wages change. If it's low, then it's harder for firms to make these adjustments. This means that industries with high elasticity can more easily replace workers with machines when wages rises. But industries with low elasticity, it's more difficult to replace workers with machines. So the difference in elasticity in the labor demand by firms differs between the short run and the long run. So we have two curves here, one representing the short run and one representing the long run. The simple reason is that in the long run, firms can vary more things. They can add more or less capital, expand to a larger facility, or shrink to a smaller one, et cetera, et cetera. Tons of different things that they can change. That's why, over the long run, firms have more flexibility to adjust both capital and labor. Short-run adjustments are more limited since firms can't quickly change their capital stock, and that's why we see a much steeper short-run labor demand curve. Marshall's rules of derived labor demand help explain the factors that determine how responsive or how elastic the demand for labor is to changes in wages. These rules give us some insight into how firms adjust their labor demand in response to wage changes based on 4 key factors. And I'll briefly touch on each of these here. So Marshall's rules explain when firms are more likely or less likely to reduce labor in response to wage increases. Now, in industries where product demand is elastic, labor can easily be substituted by capital. Labor represents a large share of costs, where capital is easily available. Labor demand will be more sensitive to wage changes. So let's take them each in turn here. First, labor demand is more elastic when the elasticity of substitution of labor and capital is greater. So the easier it is to substitute labor with capital, so things like machines, the more elastic the demand for labor is. If firms can easily replace workers with machines, it will be more responsive to wage changes. So if wages rise, the firm will substitute labor with cheaper capital, like automation or robot. So for example, in a car manufacturing plant, if wages rise, the company may choose to use more robots to assemble cars instead of hiring additional workers. Next, labor demand is more elastic when the elasticity of demand for the firm's output is greater. In other words, the more elastic the demand for the firm's product, the more elastic the demand for labor. If the demand for a firm's product is very sensitive to price changes, then when wages rise and thus production costs rise, the firm cannot easily pass on those costs to consumers. This forces the firm to reduce labor more significantly. So, for an example, a fast food restaurant faces strong competition. So if wages go up, they can't raise burger prices much without losing their customers. So instead, a firm will likely cut back on workers instead. Next, labor demand is more elastic when labor's share in total cost of production is greater. The larger the share of total production costs the labor represents, the more elastic the demand for labor. If labor is a big part of a firm's cost, even small changes in wages will have a big effect on the total cost. This ends up making the firm more responsive to changes in wages. So in industries like construction, where labor is a very significant cost, a rise in wages can drastically increase costs, which causes firms to cut back on hiring. And finally, labor demand is more elastic when the elasticity of supply of other factors of production, such as capital, is greater. So the more elastic the supply of other factors, the more elastic the demand for labor. If firms can easily get more capital or other types of inputs, they will adjust their labor demand more in response to wage changes. So if capital is hard to obtain or expensive, firms may be forced to stick with their current mix of labor and capital, even if wages rise. So for instance, in the tech industry, where it's easy to get more machines and equipment, a wage increase might lead firms to use more capital instead of labor. So far, we've assumed that there are only two inputs, labor and capital. And we assume that labor and capital are identical. Each unit is exactly the same. So each worker has the same level of skills and productivity, and all capital can be used interchangeably. Just a second or two of thought should make you think, hey, that's not true. And you're absolutely right. Remember, we often simplify things so that we can actually work with the models. Had we started out with a very complex model with a lot of different types of labor and capital, it would have been really difficult to work through. So we know that there are different types of workers with varying levels of skills and abilities, and capital often has specific uses, and new equipment can be better than old equipment. Or maybe workers don't know how to use the new equipment. Whatever the case is, often there are differences between the two. So when a firm uses multiple inputs, like different types of workers, different machines, potentially different materials, the firm will still face diminishing returns from each input. As more of any one input is used, its contribution output decreases, holding all the other inputs constant. So this is the same principle that we see in the two-factor case with labor and capital. When we just break it up, or maybe break capital and labor each into different categories, we still see the same thing holding because of the diminishing returns. So the firm will try to balance its use of inputs in a way that maximizes outputs at the lowest cost. They're still going to do that no matter how many inputs we're including in our model. So think about the pizza restaurant we talked about earlier. So I just talked about employees and capital to start out, but we can break that down further to be more realistic. The restaurant might use several different inputs. So you have cooks, servers, cleaning staff, you have ovens, tables, cash registers, all these different things. Let's hold all those constant, but just add more cooks. Initially, adding more cooks will increase the number of meals produced, but eventually, after a point, adding more cooks without increasing kitchen space or the number of ovens or numbers of tables in the restaurant just leads to congestion and eventually will lower productivity. The same applies when there are more factors of production. Eventually, the firm will reach a point when adding more of one input without increasing any of the others leads to diminishing returns. So initially, it was just simpler to rely on two inputs to see how the relationship holds more clearly. The key thing to remember here is that no matter how many inputs a firm has, it will still balance those inputs by comparing their costs and contributions to output, just as it does with two factors. Concept of diminishing returns, which holds no matter how many factors or inputs we're including, ensures that firms optimize by using different inputs efficiently. Now, we haven't really talked about substitutes and complements in this class. So I'll do a high-level summary real quick, just to show how firms deal with this. Basically, if firms are substitutes, using more of one will cause you to use less of the other. Conversely, if goods are complements, you need to use them together. So using more of one will cause you to use more of the other. Since it's around lunchtime when I'm recording this lecture, let's think of food. So hot dogs and hamburgers, for an individual person, I'm thinking my own lunch, hot dogs and hamburgers for me are substitutes. If I eat more hot dogs, I'll be able to eat fewer hamburgers. However, for example, for complements, hot dogs and hot dog buns are an example. So if I'm eating a hot dog, odds are I'm going to put it on a bun. So when I consume a hot dog, I'm also consuming a hot dog bun. For firms, if inputs in the production process are substitutes, when the price of one increases, firms will use more of the other. They'll shift to the relatively less expensive one. If the price of one falls, they'll use more of that input and less of now the relatively more expensive one. So for instance, a factory might substitute nails for screws because they use the same purpose in building furniture. So if the price of screws increase, firms will try to use more nails in the production process instead of screws because now it's relatively cheaper. Again, because they're substitutes. You're only using one or the other. Now, if two inputs are complements, then firms will use them together. So if the price of one increases, then they'll use less of both. So if the price of both decreases, then firms will use more of both. It's the exact opposite. So in this case, think of the same factor using nuts and bolts since they're used together. So if the price of bolts increase, the firms will also use fewer nuts because you're not using one without the other. All right. And now on this slide, we'll have some spoilers for chapter 4. We can combine the labor market supply curve and labor market demand curve on the same graph. They will cross at one point, in this case here in the center at the wage rate star, and employment level star. The reason they cross at one point is that the supply curve slopes upwards and the demand curve slopes downward. At the single point where they intersect, we call this the labor market equilibrium, where the number of workers willing to work at that wage equals the number of workers that firms are willing to hire at that wage. And we'll be exploring this in greater depth in the next chapter. So that brings us to the end of this module and this chapter 3. We have some assignments this week, and next week will be the midterm exam. I will be providing a sort of review for you guys so you know what concepts are going to be covered. But obviously feel free to reach out and talk to me or ask me questions about what's going to be on the exam. I recognize that for the midterm exam, it can be kind of daunting the first time you have, the exam in a class because you don't know, what the professor is going to include on it, what kind of questions are going to be. I don't want you guys to be worried about that. I just want to make sure that this is able to make sure that you understand the material. So I'm not trying to hide things or do like trick questions or anything like that. So I'll try to be as open as possible for this, so you're not worried about that sort of formatting stuff or what types of questions. You can focus on making sure that you know the material.